as you might know, social work is a very, very broad profession that brings together a lot of different expertises and sensibilities, all bound around the idea that we are trying to advance well-being among those who, in various ways and in various forms, can become or be rendered otherized. And we do that because we want to advance well-being, just fairness, dignity. We do so using ourselves as instruments of building relationships. Our profession historically has sometimes been critiqued. Like, what makes you distinct? And many people say when social work is at its best, that we are boundary spanners, we're bridgers. And so that is why your book just resonated with me so much. And then I learned over time that your book is resonating with many practitioners. So I threatened earlier this fall to have a book club where we all read this book together, and hopefully invited and was like, will John Paul and Stephen Menendian come and visit us? And here we've manifested them. So I'm really excited to be in conversation with you. I don't think these two need an introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and give an introduction. Anyway, we have John Powell, who is just a whirlwind of productivity as it relates to civil rights and civil liberties across a variety of very vexing and entrenched social issues, ranging from poverty to structural racism, et cetera, et cetera. John Powell is a professor of law, African American studies, and ethnic studies here at the University of California, and is also the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute and the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion here. So I don't know, and you managed to teach classes on advanced civil rights and managed to just come and share your wisdom with all of us, and so I'm deeply grateful. Equally prolific is Stephen Menendian, also a lawyer by training, and also just amazingly prolific. You have a forthcoming book, Structural Racism, The Dynamics of Opportunity and Race in America, forthcoming, that I hear you're just putting the finishing touches on.
Page proofing.
Page proofings. And you currently serve as the assistant director and the director of research at the Othering and Belonging Institute. So again, I think I told you why I'm so grateful that you're here and you're joining us today to present on your recent book. And to set this up a little bit, I loved, John, what you said, and I hope you don't mind that I call you John and Stephen and Susan. Is to create a practice story structure and system where we can achieve this great aspiration where everyone participates. And again, because I believe this vision resonates so much with the project of social work and social welfare, I am delighted that you are joining us in conversation with me today. So thank you, and please welcome our distinguished guests. So you are here to talk today about belonging and othering, how we save ourselves in the world. I'm a professor, so I assume everybody has read the book before they came, and I know that might be a little bit overly ambitious. But I might want to just ask you to give a light thesis of your book for our audience, in case some have not read, or what you really hope they will take out of it when they read it. The only thing I ask is we're supposed to talk loud, because our speakers are not working as well.
Sure, I'll take the first. We both looked at each other, hoping the other would take it. First of all, I just want to thank you, Susan, for inviting us. It's equally a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Just the short, brief time we've had, I feel like I'm already learning a lot from you, and this is going to be a really interesting conversation. It was also one of the best introductions I've heard for John in a while, so nice on that. So the book has two parts. The first part is about othering, the second part is on belonging. And we had these conversations, should we just open the book around belonging? If we wanted to just maximize sales, that's where a lot of people are going to be entering. What is belonging? How do we operationalize it? What are the examples of institutionalizing it, practice of belonging, design principles? The problem we had was we just felt hollow doing that. It wasn't grounded. You can create belonging, but do so on an exclusionary basis with a small we. We call that belonging based on othering. And we see a lot of examples of that right now. In fact, you can create a real sense of thick belonging, of deep community, but it's built on exclusion. And so if we just did a belonging book or opened the book with belonging, we wouldn't be honest or authentic about what we really meant as a moral vision. So we spent a lot of time, probably a disservice in terms of readers, because we know that the first part is pretty dense. I think one of the critics said it's pretty dry. But that's okay, because once you get through it and you get to part two, then it's clear skies. You know, I think it opens up and it becomes really understandable what we're trying to do. So part one is really defining what is othering, who is the other, how does othering happen, and how does identity formation, how is it bound up with the othering process? You know, when John and I were working on the book, I kept coming up with all these fascinating historical examples of othering, obscure examples that you would never have heard of before, from maybe the 14th century or the other side of the globe. And John said it's sort of like, well, there's a bird, and there's a bird, and there's a bird. Eventually you've got Audubon's Book of Birds, right? How many birds can you call before you sort of get to the undercarriage of it, the structural dynamics? And John kept saying, the other is a byproduct of the othering process. What do you mean by that? What is the othering process? So he began to think about that and look at that, what that looks like. And the first part of the book tries to give you examples of how the othering process occurs and how it's not just simply about prejudice or hatred, but really deep structural dynamics that produce the other. So that's the first half of the book. Then we get to the fun part, belonging. So the second part of the book is really defining what we mean by belonging, and we have 4 elements to the definition. And we went through all of the social psychological research, the attitudinal research, and we just felt the definitions were really inadequate. They were either valid in being predictive, but they didn't sort of give you practical application. They didn't tell you what to do. And so we wanted to come up with a definition we thought was really reflective of this vision, this moral vision of belonging without othering. And so chapter 5 sets that out, and then it tells you a little bit about how to operationalize it. And then the rest of the book is about what does it mean for our identities and our sense of self, and what does it mean for the stories and the larger narrative that we wrap ourselves within. So the thesis of the book, the theory of the book is really, how do we build a world where belonging is an aspirational value and a deep norm? And then how do we put that into practice, and we try and give guidance to the readers on how to do that.
Thank you.
So just to add a couple of things. First of all, it's a delight to be here with you. And I'll just add a couple of things to what Stephen already shared. Plus, I'll give you a little history as to our naming ourselves. Some of you may know that we at one point we were the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. And we have 7 clusters which vary in terms of subject matter and populations. So there's the health disparity cluster. There's LGBTQ cluster. There's an education cluster. There's an economic cluster. And they're all looking at issues around marginalization through structures and different populations. And there's a religious cluster and so on. And we felt at some point, we'd have this annual conference where we talked about belonging conference. But we felt at some point that all of them were doing good work. They're organized with professors on campus. And they all were sort of politely criticizing the others. You know, You think it's gender, but it's really race. You think it's race, but it's really class. You think it's class, but it's really religion, you know. And so, in a sense, they weren't, from our perspective, as curious and weren't learning from each other. They were gentle turf wars. They were gentle, but they were wars. And we felt that something was missing. What was missing was the deep structure of that all of them were dealing with othering, but they had different expressions of it, and they didn't see the common thread. And that's not just true of these brilliant professors here and colleagues, but it's true of most people. So, you know, our work is global. So in the United States, it's easy to think, if you think, because some people don't, it's easy to think that the penultimate othering process, if you want to call it that, is race, or maybe gender, or maybe race and gender, intersectionality. And maybe that's right. But here's the rub. When people think about that, they think about it in universal terms. They think, oh yeah, they say they're not doing race in India, but they really are. They may call it something else. Let's say, okay, they can call it caste, but they're really doing race. And yes, there's some correlation between colorism in India and caste, not one-to-one. And Isabel Wilkins, who I know and interviewed several times and love her work, her book, Caste, from my perspective, she conflates caste and race, right? And they inform each other, but they're also different. But one way they're not so different is that they're deep formative structures of othering. So let me just say a couple other things about othering. Talking to a friend the other day, and she was saying, it's personal color. She was saying, someone did, this happened to me just because of my race. And I said, no. This happened to you because of the othering process, because of what people are ingesting. It's not you. So, if you think about that as you, then how do we fix you? How do we fix people with disabilities? How do we fix people who are minorities? In the whole minoritizing process. So of course you're feeling bad. You're a minority. You should feel bad, right? Not realizing that there's a process that's going on that really defines not just the other, but the group that thinks they're not other. In fact, one of the major functions of othering is to constitute a kind of belonging. And so, in a sense, you can't fix the other because the other's not broke. It's serving some deep social glue. And people, I know this is not political, but here comes. People say you go to Trump rallies and people are having a good time. I said, these are not mean people. They're not sad people. These are happy people. They have a community, and I can believe that. They have a community based on belonging, predicated on othering. So, I sometimes jokingly say, professor here at Berkeley, so every 2 years I have to make up some new words. Othering and belonging, that fits. So part of the thing was the work is really trying to situate something that happens in human societies all over the world. Okay, some people will grant us that, so the social psychologists. And I should say the work is primarily, which a lot of people miss, the work is primarily social and structural, not individual. So a lot of the ways that people digest it is that, oh yeah, I know exactly, because they bake it down to the individual, which Tilly called, we're methodological individualists. Everything is about the individual. I'm not saying the individual is constituted through these processes in relationship. So if we think about the process of belonging and othering, some people will grant us, like, okay, what you've done is interesting, Stephen and John, but it's actually OHAP. Because, in some expression, belonging is everywhere. You know, like the game you see we're talking about, you know, when you say, let's look at the yellow Volkswagen, all of a sudden they're everywhere. It's like, wow, so many yellow Volkswagen. You see the person outside the window painting your car yellow, right? Yellow Volkswagens are everywhere. So belonging is everywhere, and it is. If you've been following the DEI fights, the New York Times ran that all these companies are dropping DEI and embracing something called belonging. Okay, whatever, you know, they haven't read a book, obviously. So, if belonging is so prevalent, is so ubiquitous, why do we take the time to write this book? What does it have to offer? So this is the thing. Belonging is everywhere. And I would paraphrase the Reverend Dr. King when he says, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And obviously, that's right, sort of. What's not right is that it doesn't bend by itself. It's a process that we have to be engaged in the bending. And just as we're bending it toward something, and I'll come back, I said we're bending it toward belonging. There are other people who are bending it toward exclusion. There are other people who are bending it toward othering. And I would say right now, they're filling their oats. They're going, I mean, others just going crazy. You know, I wake up in the morning and Stephen's helping with a memo to help universities and institutions create spaces of belonging in this environment. And you have the administration saying, if you do, we're going to take billions of dollars away from you, right? So it's not just at the personal level, it's at the institutional level. So what is it that we're bringing to this discussion, this note? Two or three things, many things really, but two or three things. The first is belonging without othering. So creating a global norm of belonging without othering. Now all the people who are saying, this is old hat, like now they're saying, you're crazy. You can't have belonging without othering. I mean, that's just evolutionary, baked in. It's an entailment. It's a logical necessity. It's only the only way we notice something is when we distinguish, then they get out. So we've lost them now. So that's what the book is also challenging. It's sort of engaged, and a lot of this come out of the more recent stuff as people are thinking about the mind science and then thinking about evolution. You have Harari's book, Sapiens. Like, yeah, we were in these small tribes, and the mind got habituated to othering. Wrong. So that's one of the most important things to knock down. That this is what Unger would call a false necessity. That we think we're wired to other is evolutionarily necessary. And I'll just give you the highlights of why that's not true, and then maybe turn it back to Susan so we can have a real dialogue. Let me give you another historical moment before I do that, though. So a good friend of mine, a colleague, I learned a lot from, is Derek Bell. Bell wrote a lot of things. One of the things he talked about was convergence. He talked about basically that poor whites and rich whites would converge in their interests. So he called it interest conversion. And therefore, necessarily, racism is a permanent fixture of America because of interest conversion. They're smart, and he says, if you look at history, when it looks like we're making progress, when it looks like maybe the white elites are siding with the downtrodden blacks. He says it's just a blip. If you wait long enough, you will see something happen, a conflict between poor whites and rich whites, and they will resolve that conflict, as in the Reconstruction, by making common cause against the racial interest conversion. And you know, it's sort of amazing to me. I actually wrote this, so it's, you know, it's not a secret. And a few people now have said maybe Derek was wrong. I would say in writing, I probably was the first one to say wrong. Why is that wrong? Just think about what he's saying. Basically, he's not just essentializing race, which is, you know, academia is a bad thing, even though we do it. He's also essentializing interests. There's white interest and black interest, and it's relatively stable, so we can always go back to it. Wait a minute, how do we deal with that when we say race is socially constructed? Race is socially constructed by necessity. Interest is socially constructed, which means it's constantly shifting. But then, again, Derek is smart. He's saying, well, sometimes it looks like blacks and whites, usually poor blacks and rich whites, are really coming together, and something positive, different is about to happen. But just wait, and it's going to go away. And I said, Derek, what you've done is made a hypothesis that can't be disproved. Because anytime there's a disproof of your hypothesis, you say, just wait. Why can't I flip it and say every time it looks like there's interest conversion, that's temporary, just wait. Why is the interest conversion phenomenon real and the interest diversion process not real? There's no empirical way of disproving it, right? So anyway, so I'm saying all that to say that they're very smart, powerful people who fall on the side of we have to make others in order to have belonging. Social welfare. You are our cousins. No, you're our cousins. You're our brothers and sisters. Okay? Now, why do I say that? Because part of the thing, when people make that argument, how do I have a sense of me unless I differentiate myself from Stephen? So that seems to be a pretty powerful argument that there's a natural need to differentiate and therefore other. Two mistakes. Differentiation is not othering. They're not the same process. They get conflated. Secondly, we're talking about the phenomena of belonging and othering on a social level, not simply on an individual level. And there's a problem with aggregation, as you know. If you know something at the individual level, it means you know something at the individual level. It doesn't mean you know anything about the social level. And because we're methodological individuals, we don't realize that. And then the last thing I'll say on this, and then throw it back to Susan. What about all the time that we lived in tribes and we just naturally were hardwired to be suspicious of the other? Well, of course, there's the recent book by Gorber about equality that calls all that into question. But here's the thing. The people who sort of trade on the tribal thing, first of all, make a number of serious mistakes. There's something implicit in that that's problematic. Because tribe then is associated with being nasty, being selfish, being mean, being warlike. Most historians believe many of those things associated with being nasty, being mean, being warlike, being hoarding, is actually a modern phenomenon, not a pre-modern. The stuff happened in pre-modern. It's not a war, by some accounts. There were certainly fights, but war, as we understand it, is a relatively new phenomenon. Some people say it had to wait out to after the agricultural revolution, right? These standing armies. We can't have standing armies and hunter-gatherers at the same time. It's a contradiction, right? The other thing, though, is that the theory of tribes is that you have 150 people, 200, 250 at most, although that's been challenged, that you spend your whole life with. That the idea of belonging is predicated on daily interaction for your entire life. You're born into a group, I call it a band, not a tribe. You're born into a group, and you spend your whole life with that group. You depend on them for everything, right? And therefore, they become, quote unquote, your tribe. They become where you belong. Okay, so how does that explain your sense of belonging with 280 million people called white in the United States because you're white? People that you'll never see, people that you never know, people that you never sit down and have food with. Okay, but you're all Americans. What does that have to do with intimacy? What does it have to do with knowing them? You don't know them. What's holding them together is not intimate knowledge. Okay, take it one step higher. There are 2.2 billion people in the world who call themselves Christian. Now, Christians fight against each other because, you know, some of the Protestants say Catholics are not real Christians. They both would agree that Mormons are not Christian. But be that as it may, there are a lot of people across the world that call themselves Christian. And they're not, you know, I mean, the Pope could say, all right, your brethren in the Mediterranean need you to go out and fight the Muslims and die. But you're doing it as for the Christian brotherhood. Like, yay, let's send our son out to die for strangers that we've never seen, that we'll never know, in favor of a God that we've never seen and we think we know. So what's creating that glue? It's not intimate contact. It's saying what Harari would say, or McMahon, it's a good story. It's a story based on imagination. What creates the nation state is not intimacy, it's a story. And right now, we're in the midst of someone trying to tell a different story. And they're saying, oh, these people don't belong. What are they doing here? But they were born here. It doesn't matter. Send them to El Salvador. They're bad hombres. My point is that there's a different process. And McMahon, in the history of equality, says that the cognitive revolution created a break in biology. Meaning that when sapiens learned to imagine and tell stories, it created new possibilities that are unheard of. Money? Money didn't exist, you know, very long. The fact that we all believe in it now is an incredible story. And so what other stories can we create? And I'm going to end just by saying this. 2,000 plus years ago, the world was very divided, very small and so it's very divided. But 99% of people on the planet were Serbian. They were either enslaved or serfs. Or the elite was extremely small. And the rest of those people were not people at all. They were just there to serve the royalty, the god kings or whatever. And then some guy came along and said, everybody, all these minions running around here are children of God. Of course, that guy was Jesus. Jesus made a pronouncement over 2,000 years ago that every human being, these minions, these enslaved people, these women, are children of God. It's probably hard to wrap your mind around how radical a concept, how radical a story that was. It was reaching toward, I didn't quite get there, reaching toward belonging without othering. And if you looked at the world, you'd have said, there must really be something powerful in that wine they're drinking, right? For someone to believe that. And yet, I say to people, who was the Caesar? Who was when Jesus was executed? 99% of people don't know. Everybody knows Jesus, they don't know who was the head of the most powerful empire in the world when Jesus was alive. Come forward, and you keep doing this. 250 plus years ago, 250 years ago, there was a committee, and they said, you know, let's do something different. We don't want to be part of this great English empire. We're going to declare independence. So they wrote the Declaration of Independence. And then Jefferson said, what about, I was in France, what, let me put this in here. We hold certain truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And Jefferson took that seriously at some level, notwithstanding the fact that he had 600 people enslaved. So again, someone could turn to Jefferson and say, what the hell are you talking about? And the country's been struggling with that, right? And in 1948, World War II, over 100 million people killed. 6 million Jews slaughtered. Africa cut up as colonies of Europe. Women all around the world could not vote. And Eleanor Roosevelt, United Declaration of Human Rights, pushed in there that every human being had inherent dignity. And W.B. Du Bois was so upset, he confronted her. It's like, Eleanor, what the hell are you talking about? So I'll just end by saying, if you look at those examples, it's not that the world reflects those examples. It's that someone had the imagination to put a flag in the ground for what's called a regulative ideal. This is what we're going to. This is what that moral arc that King was talking about, this is where it's going if we bend it that way. And we think that is what belonging without othering is. It's the next moral arc. It's saying, and you have people pushing back, you have the dark enlightenment people saying people are not equal, women are not equal, we should just say it. That's their story, but it's not our story. So we try to tell a different story.
So, okay, this is great. I love it when we do big, deep, conceptual thinking about what these concepts mean. I'm gonna make a right turn, and I'm gonna take it very applied, because I'm a social worker. How about this? So many times, social workers are kind of working at a particular point of great potential for belonging with othering. How about
Without
that? What potential, actually I should talk with a strength. We have many potentials to promote belonging with othering, okay? And we also have tendencies, because we work within institutions, or work with populations who perhaps have had many experiences of belonging with othering. And I'm thinking about that project at this time, and practices that we're struggling through when we do seem at this point to be very, very fragmented. Before you got here, John, we were talking about your concept of like polarization, not a great word. Tendencies to fragment, and I guess I'm not forming a question here. How do we think bigger about these stories to bridge these sources of fragmentation? And your book is like, these stories have to be special stories. There's a great power of narrative. There's also vulnerabilities in some of the narratives of the past, or the narratives tactics we may have used in the past. But what do you see as aspirations towards these bigger stories? How do we develop our hygiene to be better meta storytellers in this sense? To get to this belonging without othering.
So, I don't know, I don't have a short answer.
No, that's okay.
So think about this, again, the examples I gave. And these are stories, right? So when Jesus says that we're all children of God, that's a story. But he didn't do research and see how people reacted to it. If he did, maybe he wouldn't have been crucified. The point I'm making is that part of it has to be real in terms of our conviction. Part of it has to be, this is who we are. I'm a bridger. That doesn't mean I bridge all the time. You know, we work now with organizers all over the country because we've found, research shows that when you bridge, the practice of bridging, which is really listening to another person, not just with your head, but also with your heart. It's being curious about someone. It's basically seeing them as a full human being with dignity. That when you do that, something magical happens. So now they're saying, this works. We should do this. So we go talk to our opponent and pretend like we're interested in them and listening. We can persuade them to do anything. And I said, it's not pretend. You know, they can smell a frog. I mean, you have to, it's interesting, research is very interesting because oftentimes when people start off pretending, they get pulled in. But when you really listen to another person, listen with your heart, not just with your head. The ego, back to that, the ego, the head tends to, especially if people have been at Berkeley, they tend to look for flaws. Aha! You missed the footnote. That wasn't the right footnote. You know, I heard you say, in my mind, that's my mind. My mind's like, contradiction? Oh no, that was a contradiction. So, the mind, the ego wants to be right. It's even better if Stephen's wrong. I get to be right, and Stephen's wrong. Yay! The heart is about relationships, which is different than right and wrong. It's a whole different valence. And so if we can connect, now the tricky thing is we can connect with someone one-on-one, but how do we do it for 8 billion people?
Yes.
How do we do it for 340 million people? How do we do it? We've done it. We've done it, right? Most Americans feel something special about being American. And certainly when they're outside the country, it's like, oh, hey, there's another American, yay! It's like, why are you yelling at me? You know? So the point is that there are expressions of it being done all the time. And so part of it, and certainly Eleanor Roosevelt didn't test, when the Declaration of Human Rights was passed, was adopted in 1948, it was, as W.B. Du Bois says, just symbolic. And I say he was right and he was wrong. You know, this is a giant, so how can you say a giant is wrong? Well, I'm whatever. I think sometimes if there's a God, the jury's out. I don't know what the jury for God is, but anyway, the jury's out. If there's a God, I think God has been wrong more than once. I mean, I said that to ministers. Like, God turning people into bags of dust, that doesn't work for me, but I'm God. At least it really doesn't work for me if you're God. But the point I'm making is that Eleanor Roosevelt didn't test it. It didn't, I mean, and it wasn't reflected in the world. It was a deep, I would even say maybe spiritual conviction. It was a deep aspiration. It was something, so that's part of it. Then how do you take it to scale? And this gets back to some of the work that Stephen's doing, right? You do it in terms of, Jeffrey Cohen has written a book on belonging. He says, stop focusing on people and focus on the environment. Focus on behavior. Focus on, I mean, our individualist mode is like, how do I change someone's mind? And now how do I change someone's subconscious mind? How do I change someone's implicit bias? It's like you're missing the point. When Claude Steele talks about stereotype threat, he's not saying fix the person, he's saying fix the environment. You know? So, and we've done it. We've done it, you know, at our best when we integrated schools, when we created diverse settings. So I'll give you one last example, then I'll turn over to Stephen. One of the most powerful institutions in our country that has done this relatively well at scale, it's the military. But think about the military, especially in the 1960s, 70s. You have poor black kids from Detroit, poor white kids from Alabama, poor Latino kids from, LA, 18 years old. 18-year-olds automatically poor at 18. You take all these young men, because they're all men in it, give them a fancy gun, and put them a hole together, and see what happens, right? And you know what happened? Race wars. Vietnam was peppered with constant race wars where people were turning against each other. And the military said, this ain't working, folks. We have to do something to create a common sense of belonging. And they did it. And it was so effective that literally people would say, I made buddies with someone when I was in that foxhole 40 years ago. We were still buddies. But that person is conservative and you're a liberal. It doesn't matter, that's my brother. Right? And we did it at scale, not, people going. So there are all these examples that we keep missing. There's a book out now that talks about the importance of rituals for people to join. It looks at all bloodletting and stuff like that. They have these men, usually men, go through these very intense rituals where they're searing their skin, but they're building bonds. Obviously, I'm not advocating that, but I'm saying we actually know a lot about building bonds. We know a lot about creating stories. And to your question, Susan, I was just saying before turning to Stephen, we're gonna be doing some experimentation. We're gonna have some failures. So think about this. Again, 2.2 billion people who call themselves Christians, starting 2,000 years ago, without the internet, without the printing press, without Facebook. So they're doing it really in a labor-intensive way. Now, with one hit on the computer, you can reach literally. So I did a thing with John Legend, and most of you may not know who John Legend is. How many know who John Legend is? Of course. All right. So anyway, I said, okay, John Legend. I know he's famous, but I didn't know really who he was. So I said I should go online and see what he's doing and see why is people so excited. Let me see. I'll look at some of his music video and see how many hits they got. One of them had 2.3 billion hits. One dude.
So I think part of what your question is about is not just design, but practice.
Yes.
How do we get to a practice of belonging without othering? And so part of it is conceptual, narrative, storytelling, all of these things. But part of it also, we need people who are bridgers. Bridgers are the glue, the interstitial pieces and the liminal spaces that allow us to meld together and sort of cement these communities around a larger vision that's not narrow and parochial. And there's an essay by Danielle Allen, who is a philosophy professor at Harvard, and she's written this essay about a connected society, which unfortunately a lot of these things we discover after our book is out. That's how it goes. And what she says is you have people who are already in their professions natural bridgers, translators, social workers, educators. There are people who are already in these spaces. So part of the task, I think the task is twofold. The first is how can we learn from them? And the second, how can we empower and support them? Because the worst thing we could do for social workers is to have them in this really tense, inflamed, really challenging emotional environment and not take some of the burden off their shoulders. Or at least how can we, be a load-bearing wall for them in this environment? My mother was a social worker, MSW, then later a clinical social worker. So I understand the emotional stress and difficulty of coming from that. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's a profession, particularly in this environment, where there's a lot of burnout. So how can we support people who are in these spaces, both institutionally and then also interpersonally and in their service? One example I love to talk about is school counselors. Parallel, not quite the same as social work, but a school counselor, think about the position in an institution of a school building. What does a school counselor can do? What can they do? First of all, in a sense, they're a censor, right? If the climate is off, there's an episode or an event in a school building, they are the antenna for the administration that can sense that. If there's a racial episode or a conflict or a tense moment, the trauma and the emotional wavelength and bandwidth that goes through the school goes through the counselor. The counselor is the frontline responding agent. They're the one who can try and tell the principal and the teachers, here's what you should do. Here's what we can programmatically respond. Maybe we need to have bring all the students together and have a conversation, or maybe we need to have some other kind of intervention. Social workers are like that. They are, in a sense, natural bridgers. They're going to spaces, that other people aren't going into, and we need them, and we need to support and empower them so that they can help us build that larger, not just the bridge, but larger sense of belonging. And as Bell Hooks reminds us, and as John is fond of saying, bridges are meant to be walked on. So being a bridge and being a bridger is not easy. In fact, I get this is the most common question we get. One of the most common questions we get about bridging is the burden of bridging unfair or asymmetric? And the answer is yes. It's always going to be asymmetric. If you have a bridge and you're trying to span the bridge, one side of that bridge is often going to represent more marginalized peoples, more marginalized communities, historically oppressed. The other side is going to be a little bit more privileged. It's always asymmetric. Life is asymmetric. The question is, are we going to just continue forward on this path, or are we going to do something about it? Because the status quo is unacceptable.
So let me just add one other thing. So hard work, right? But also easy work. How many of you know about the Yellow Vest movement in France? Anyone? Okay, a couple. So these were demonstrations in France. I don't know if they're still going on. They went on for years, and they were sort of middle to lower middle class French who would come out every week and demonstrate. And they were not initially very successful, but eventually they became a political force. And when they interviewed these people, they were trying to figure out why you come out every week, these demonstrations, you're getting shot with rubber bullets and being spat upon by people. And what they said was community. That they created a community. This is where they belong. In their private life, they were all isolated. To them, it was like coming to a party every week to see friends. So the good news is, people need, want, and have a longing to belong. And it just, from my perspective, that explains 2/3 of Trump. Is he's offering people a space to belong. And he may be doing it with snake oil, and we're saying, I can't believe you're buying that stuff. And some people are like, I'm not buying that stuff. There was a study showing the rapid rise in conservative evangelicals joining churches and stuff like this, literally hundreds of thousands. And they start interviewing, so what's driving this? Do you believe in, do you feel saved? Is God calling you? And literally, they said, this is a place where I belong. So people are looking for that. So that's, so the hard thing is it's hard, but the good thing is people want it. But here's the trick. So in a space of fragmentation, in a space of fear, in a space of belittlement, the part of the brain, right, that becomes most active is the lizard brain, is the amygdala. And you gotta engage at that level. And the amygdala does not check footnotes. And so we have a study. It's like, did you see the latest study coming out of Berkeley? It's like, hell no. I don't want to see the latest. I didn't see the study before that one. I don't read studies coming from Berkeley. We were talking, Susan, Stephen, and I, just before we came up, is that you notice movie theaters are dying. Have anyone noticed that? Used to be what, 5, 4 downtown Berkeley, now there's none. You know what else is dying? Bookstores. And literally my family, the working class family in Detroit, my brother would say, you know, I have all your books next to my bed, I haven't read one of them. You know, so they give me a headache. This is my brother. He loves me. And he was not joking. You know? And he's proud. My brother wrote another book. It's like, what is it about? Who knows? The point I'm making is that what he's saying, I'm not talking to his amygdala. You know, so part of the thing is how. So when Trump does something that from the prefrontal cortex, from the rational perspective, is completely idiotic, we think, how can anyone believe that? It's not how they believe it, they believe it in the back of their mind. They're not operating in the same way. So it's not just telling stories. We're meaning-making, feeling animals. And a lot of the stuff, unfortunately, that we teach students doesn't, maybe meaning-making, maybe, but not meaning through, you know, Kierkegaard or, you know, whatever. It's like, do you feel me? Do you feel me? What do you mean feeling? I mean, literally, when I went to school 1,000 years ago, someone would say, I'm not interested in your feelings. Tell me what you think, right? There's that sharp division between the mind and the body. And the body was just something that carried the mind, otherwise it was useless. And so that's part of it, right? That if you can do this with 18-year-olds in Vietnam, create these deep communities, why can't we do it here?
I was wondering, I feel we only have a few more minutes, and I was hoping that I could invite the audience to ask some questions as well, because I'll keep talking. But any questions for John or Stephen? Jean?
Hello.
How do you think about the role of culture within this structure?
Well, I think it's very important. And so I suggest that we're meaning-making animals. And you know, this subjective reality, this objective reality, and there's intersubjective, which is where culture really is. Culture is about meaning-making. And so we may all agree on the facts. Something happened on January 6th. Something happened. Right and left will agree on that. What does it mean? We don't agree on that. So culture sort of helps us ground meaning. So it's extremely important. And it's not linear, right? I don't know I'm sure, I don't know, I say this, but I don't really know. I'm sure many of you have had the experience where you're listening to a song. I lived in Tanzania for a while, and there was singing there that literally would just make you cry. Now, I didn't even understand the words, but it just, you know, it just touched me, right? And we've seen that happen episodically here. And so culture is extremely important. And the stories we tell ourselves are extremely important. If you think about, right now we're literally scrubbing our websites. We're trying to take Sojourner Truth out of the story of the Underground Railroad. It's like, why? Right? Most people don't even know. But still, they're going to African American museums, like, take all this stuff out about slavery. You know, we have an empty building here pretty soon. No, we're putting white people. You know, they're telling stories. So culture is important, and it's important, especially to people in some ways who are not going to read my book. You know, but so how we, and culture is not just how I feel. It's how we feel. It's our collective feeling. And so part of the frame right now is, how do we feel proud about being Americans, right? People want to feel proud. And the left, oftentimes, like, you should not be proud of being American. It's a terrible country. you know, it's like, go away. So anyway, and last thing I'll say is that, so culture is important, telling stories is important, and this is the rub, telling complicated stories, I think is part of the secret sauce. Telling a complicated
Yes.
story. Quick example. How many of you saw Black Panther? Show of hands, all right. So, who was the hero of Black Panther? Was it Black Panther or was it Killmonger? Right? Which is unusual. Usually it's like villain over here, hero over here, and the hero never gets dirty, and the villain never gets clean. That's not life. We need to tell complicated stories. So can we tell a story where there's stuff to be proud of about being American and the stuff to critique it? So anyway.
I love that. Thank you. That's a beautiful analogy. How do we tell complicated stories where, by gum, it seems like though they don't get traction when they're the more complicated.
Go
they
talk
are.
to Pixar.
But
Okay.
they, yeah. So culture is immensely important. By the way, I think we can probably at least go to 7:30 if you're
Okay.
open to it. But so the thing about culture is, first of all, what is culture? So I think culture is having several traits. Number one, it's collective, social, repeated behavior. And once you realize just repeated behavior, it's everything we do. It's the food, the type of food we share, it's our language, it's our rituals, it's our holidays. I was reading an article in the Smithsonian about a tribe of monkeys in Japan. And the parent monkeys had taught the younger monkeys how to open a shell. No other monkeys in Japan know how to do this thing, but it's cultural. It's trained repetitive behavior. So culture is very important in a lot of ways. And it can facilitate us towards belonging without othering or reinforce belonging based on othering. Think about, I'm gonna take us into the toxic manosphere, right? The critique of toxic masculinity. In our book, we talk a lot about this. So the APA, the American Psychological Association, maybe 5 years ago, issued this guidance saying that masculinity in its traditional form is very problematic. It leads to men repressing their emotions. It leads to sexual violence, interpersonal violence, this list of things which are well-founded. The question then is, if you live in a culture where masculine ideal, male identity is based in masculinity, what do you do about it? And you have option one, we repress masculinity. Option two, we corral it. We just, okay, it's fine to allow people to be masculine and have, whatever, rah-rah on the football field, or maybe in the military, but not in the classroom, not in civic spaces, the legislature, right? So the option one is we repress, option two is we corral, option three is we rewrite it. We do something else. But if you just have options one or two, how are boys and young men gonna respond to that? I think we have seen the results of that in the last election, where young men 18 to 29 are more conservative, more right-wing than millennials, even Gen Xers, which everyone thought would be a conservative generation. In fact, I think more young men voted for Trump in the exit polls than white men over 75 or over 70. Shocking data. So, and we see this on race too. It's like, if the message is that white people are all privileged, all oppressors, is it surprising we get cases like Rachel Dolezal? Is it surprising that people want to, you get derangements from these kinds of responses? And so in the classroom, someone said, are those the only options on offer? Is it either, maybe there's another thing we can do, but you can't just take someone's identity without replacing it with something. And so the stories we tell, by the way, the most successful stories in human history are the most complicated. When we were writing the book, so think, what are the two most enduring epic narratives in human history, possibly? Certainly a candidate would be the Odyssey and the Iliad by Homer. Not as old as Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is another candidate. There's plenty of candidates. But ancient, right? You're talking over 3,000 years old. What is the function of the Odyssey and the Iliad? Especially the Iliad, there is no categorical villain. There is no categorical hero. In the Odyssey, it's Odysseus as a protagonist, but he certainly is not a traditional hero in the kind of, Disney sense that you would think today. What does it do? What the function of the Odyssey and the Iliad is, it's a mega narrative epic that tells everyone who they are and where they sit in the universe. It identifies all the gods, all the different players, the Trojans, the Greeks, everyone has a place in this story. And so what we need are modern collective organizing narratives, what Harari calls collective organizing myths, that tell us who we are and what our roles are, and everyone has to have a positive role, where no one is a categorical villain. And people respond to that, well, don't you need a villain in the story to have an effective story? The answer is no. I mean, we have tons of effective stories, whether like Black Panther, even Star Wars. I mean, the villains end up being, a complicated hero in a sense, redeemed. All of our best stories are actually complicated. There's a book called Wonderworks by Angus Fletcher, who's a professor of storytelling, that talks about the fable and so on. They have what he calls the fairy tale twist, where it doesn't line up with sort of the moral or ethical expectation. We talk a little bit about this in the book. Complicated stories, where things happen randomly. And those are actually the stories that have endured, not the neat, pat, Disneyfied versions of them. The Grimm's fairy tales, the Odyssey, the Homer, not just Western societies, but African stories, East Asian stories, they're complicated. They're
And we
complicated.
respond to that
We-
psychologically.
We
Yeah.
encode them, we
We're
embody
wired for
them,
that.
we live them, yes.
Thank you. Go ahead, thank you.
Thank you,
Could you turn up the volume a little bit?
Oh yeah, you have to talk loud.
Okay. Thank you, John and Stephen, for sharing your work, your book. I'm a social work practitioner, and I came across your book during pandemic because the anti-Asian hate, and then and also reading the research saying Asian Americans reported the lowest sense of belonging in America. And so I got curious about this idea of belonging. And then your definition resonated with me the most. And I love the 4 elements, the inclusion, connection, and recognition, and influence. Even just the day-to-day practice, I can really bring these 4 elements, thinking about, my office, do I have a rainbow flag to make my clients feel like an inclusive environment? And we're always looking at our working relationship, is it connected? And also make them feel they are recognized and their identities are visible. And also, can they also participate in the treatment? So we are co-creating this work together. So it's just really like tangible to me. And now I'm extending this to my family work because your book's more social level. So I'm like thinking about the family is also a small social group, right? And because I'm also having an Asian family, even just within the family, for different situations, scenarios, it's gonna be one member, different members that they will feel excluded in the family. And so I'm really clinically inquiring what relational and societal processes that are impacting the family or people's sense of belonging. Of course, if I'm thinking about your book, one way is that, okay, we wanna look at if there's I'm gonna go back and be more about the first part because the more challenging one, to see what contributes to the othering process, right? And the other way would be, I'm gonna look at these 4 elements to see if these 4 elements showing up in the therapeutic process. But my question is, since you have written a book and then studied this topic, just this question, what relational and societal processes that are impacting people's belonging? Do you have more specific that the processes you have discovered? Yeah, so that's my question.
Well, let me just say this, that if you go to our website,
Okay.
there's a lot there. I mean, yes, we're constantly learning. Stephen sort of intimated this. And maybe this will be true in the future where books are never done. right? You're constantly learning, and we want this to be a co-creation, not just with, with all of us. We continue to learn. And then the background containers are really important. I can tell you, in my own family, and I talk about this in the Bridging book, I was excluded from my family for a while. And I went through many different iterations, but one of the things that actually created more space of belonging in my own family for me was I was credentialized by people that were important to my mom and dad, right? So there was something, I forget the exact details, but I was living in Miami and I was doing something and I was on television and the mayor of Miami was there singing my praises. All of a sudden, it happened a couple of times. Once I was on Oprah, and again, relatives saw me on Oprah, and it's like, I had to be cool. I mean, I'm on Oprah. More complicated. So part of what I'm saying is that, and part of the thing about bridging, especially when bridging in groups, and it's like, it's not just between two people. It's oftentimes, there's someone, in my own family, my mom was really the glue. She, so I had to fight with my dad, or my brother, or my sister, and my mom was like, nope, you guys gotta work this out, because we're family, and my mom and dad are both passed, and my siblings are old. We have fights now, which we don't very often, but there's no one there to pull us back together. And that happens not just in families, but it happens in larger group settings. And so one of the things that's sometimes hard is that, so people will engage in stuff, maybe they don't like something you're doing, but also they will engage in stuff because they want to belong. So if the group defines belonging by othering you, then if someone stops othering you, their status in the group may be compromised. Just think about that. It's like you say, I'm Democratic and my girlfriend's Republican. My friends said, what? It's like, what you doing with that woman, right? But I didn't know anything else. That's just an example, but it's probably some truth in it, right? We had a conference recently and we had a well-known evangelical speak.
Conservative evangelical.
Yeah, white, I mean, it's like all the tropes, right? And it just leading up to it, people were like pissed. What is he doing here? I don't feel safe as he's here. And I said, literally, there are 3,000 people here. One conservative guy is going to make you unsafe. Don't worry, if he attack you, I'll put Stephen between him. But what they were doing, they weren't really calling him out, they were calling me out. They're saying, how could you do this? In my own staff, right? It's like, you're gonna lose credibility. So there's these complicated dynamics to belonging. It's not just, and as social workers, I think you would appreciate that. It's not just between the two people. You're in the containers, inside of containers, inside of containers.
So I just want to say thank you, first of all. It's heartening to hear you incorporate this framework into your practice. And also that you're doing it successfully. That's really encouraging. We put this work out here, but we don't know how it's always applied. I think the answer is, in the family practice, the principles are roughly the same. My guess is that one of the big missing pieces in families is feeling seen and heard. So you read about these fracturing. There's been this debate that's been going on in the press lately about no contact between adult children and their parents. Should I go no contact? Is that fair? It's been an ongoing debate. And my sense is that what often happens is, when children reach maturity and become adults, the relationship between parents often shifts, in fact, can invert, right? Like, in some sense, children become the parents, especially as with aging parents. And so part of it is in the family practice. Maybe the question I would ask everyone in the family is, do you feel seen and heard? 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 Or do people feel invisible? Or do people feel they have to shade or hide the parts of their identity because of judgments within the parent? I was listening to Chimamanda Adichie's recent talk at City Arts and Lecture, John has done, I think, three interviews at the City Arts and Lecture with Justice Jackson and other people. Jim Monday was there recently, and she said, I always tell young writers, don't share your drafts with your parents. Don't share your drafts with your parents, because especially if you are African or Indian or East Asian, you will hide part of yourself. You won't be honest, you know? So part of the challenge is to belong. People cannot feel a sense of belonging if they cannot feel that they are heard, seen, and recognized, and their identity is fully respected. That's true in institutional, that's true in communities, but it's also true in families. And if people feel like if you are queer and you have a evangelical parent, you know, that can be a source of friction. Can the person at least recognize you and respect you? That's going to be a fundamental question in the family context. So I think just going through those elements, but particularly that question around recognition. Do you feel seen and heard? Not just seen, but heard. And then also family, many institutions are hierarchical. We are not anti-hierarchy. I think many people would consider us radical egalitarians, and we probably are. But we are not anti-hierarchy per se. Some institutions require hierarchy. You have to have people who decide. We also think there's nothing wrong with valorizing serving professions. We have a footnote in there. Like, if we lived in a society that said, we are going to put on a pedestal teachers and nurses and social workers, I think we'd be fine with that, right? We're not anti that. What we are is anti-hierarchy that's based on fixed and immutable characteristics. You know, that's the key for us. So if people, where there's, you know, people moving into certain things, we should and can valorize certain things. And that's, by the way, part of the reason we think it's possible to have belonging without othering, because if you look around the world, there's no society where any particular identity has always been strictly other. It's always contingent and contextual, and we could get into that if you'd like, but I think that's the starting point is, to each member of the family, do you feel seen and heard? Okay, from there, then, do you feel empowered to speak? You know, and one of the metaphors that John has developed and I've developed in this book is the concept of the party. Are you a guest, which is contingent and provisional, or are you on the party planning committee? You know, so that happens in families where there is a sense of hierarchy, but that aging is an interesting and strange thing that can flip those dynamics or complicate them. Thank you so much for the question.
Thanks for the presentation. So there's something that was said about the process of differentiation being separate from, or something like that, separate from the process of belonging. Okay, so I sort of wanted to push for a more complicated story here. Especially, I'm thinking in light of Levinas, this philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who used other in a different sense as like a respectful other. So in light of that, and also in light of my own life, I feel like sometimes people are almost like samed, almost like they're grouped together as the same in a way which does not see their differences. So the pushback roughly I wanted to say was, I almost feel like we need to pay attention to the process of how we go about differentiating or how we navigate differences in both how we see, I don't know, people closer to us, people outside us, something like that, in terms of, what are your feeling thoughts about it?
Sure. A great question. So, Martha Minow used to be the dean at Harvard. She wrote a book. She talked about what difference does a difference make. It's not difference that's the issue. It's what's the meaning of it. You know, so you say red or yellow, and it's actually it is complicated because to differentiate, where we use othering is not just hierarchical, is power dynamic oftentimes, it's diminishing, and it's to some extent categorical. And it's social. We're not talking about individuals. To even say individuals, right, is to distinguish. one of the things we talk about in terms of ways in which we can actually come together with this complexity is to realize that we are all multiple beings. We carry multiple selves. And the multiplicity of those are dynamic. They're not static. And again, they're not necessarily hierarchical. So the you that's a loving son is not necessarily better than the you that's a great student. And yet they may be very different, and sometimes they may clash, right? And they also may inform each other. And so we expressly say, because liberalism is based on oftentimes a dichotomous thinking. It's either or, not both and. So we oftentimes say that the reality is liberals would think the solution to othering is saming. In a sense, the liberal paradigm suggests if you notice a difference, there's automatically a categorical hierarchy. And so that's one reason, for example, within the context of race, we say the way to deal with racism is not to see race, right? Because as soon as you see it, the hierarchy is there, right? Wrong, you know, and not possible to not see race. And then it goes even further, assimilation. I can accept you if you become me. Ooh, I don't want to become you. I mean, you may be cool, but man, I don't want to be you. And I can't be you, right? And so it's also lazy. A church is just like a mosque, just like a synagogue. Really? Have you been to a church, a mosque, or synagogue? Your solution, and what is being collapsed into is like, be just like me. It's not be all the same, it's be just like me. I become the normative ideal. And as long as you achieve that ideal, which you never will, you're okay. Which means you can never really belong. And it's like, who made you the boss? Why do I want to be like you? Why don't you, okay, we're gonna assimilate to me, right? So all those sort of liberal tropes, which were sincere. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, when people were saying, Arthur Schlesinger, someone I knew and respected, a great writer, a great mind, he wrote a book called Disuniting America. And his whole thing was, we had to assimilate. When people was like, oh, one day we'll all be fine because we're gonna intermarry, every kid is gonna be beige, and we won't notice difference. It's to locate the difference out in the world. And so this is really a sociology of creating meaning around apparent differences. Those differences don't exist just out there. Both in terms of recognizing them and giving meaning is a sociological process. And so we don't call for saming. Because saming basically says, if we're all straight, we can all get along. Well, I don't know if I'm straight. Well, come back when you know, right? Whereas belonging says, you belong, full stop. It's not contingent. It's not after you perform. It's not after you become like me. It's you belong. And the world that we cohabit together will also be co-created together. Very different. And, you know, we're not assigning any group the power to normalize. There's, you know, I'm sure you know that book, The End of Average. There's a book called The End of Average. See the end of average and the normal. True story. The United States are making fighter jets. And they look at the size of all of the potential pilots, look at the weight, look at the arm length, and they build a cockpit for the average pilot. And accidents go up, not down. Efficiency goes down, not up. And they're confused. It's like, you know, before we just had, you know, we didn't pay attention, we just built it, we didn't think about it. Now we've actually been scientific, and we've taken the average. It's like finding a family with 2.1 kids, you know? I'm still looking for that 0.1, and it turns out nobody was average. Average is a composite, average is an abstraction. And so trying to be average actually did us a disservice to everybody. So, as opposed to looking at people's particularities. And someone who's 5'7" is not necessarily better than someone who's 5'8", but they're different.
So I think your question is really incisive and strikes upon one of the most complicated areas of our book. It's complicated because it's so counterintuitive. So counterintuitive. And we have a discussion of this in part 1 and a discussion of this in part 2. In part 1, we spend a lot of energy trying to make the case for why you should think in the frame of othering. And we compare othering to these other frames that are close, like caste, insiders and outsiders, and so on. And we push for othering as the kind of better frame for these kinds of things. But we basically say is there are infinite bases on which human beings can differentiate ourselves, right? There's no end, literally infinite. Cultural, language, eye color, hair color, height, gender, sexual orientation, sexual orientation, clothes, there's no end to the bases. But why is it that othering only happens on a relatively small number out of that infinite? It's because certain things become relevant and certain things don't, right? I mean, most of the bases for differentiation are social constructions. Religion, national identity, race. These are not, baked into human biology. They are things that we adopt. So if it's not difference itself, because there's infinite differences, it has to be certain relevant differences. What is the principle that makes certain differences relevant? It's the organizations of societies. It's the way in which societies evolve and emerge that makes certain differences relevant. So it's not difference itself. It's, as John says, the meanings that attach to those differences, right? Like we could segregate society by people who are over 5'5" and people under 5'5". We don't. Why? Because that's not a relevant difference in terms of social identities for us. Instead, we segregate people by race, and we segregate people by gender, and we segregate people by class. We segregate our neighborhoods are segregated by people by political ideology. People live in Republican neighborhoods with other Republicans, and Democrats live in Democratic neighborhoods. So you have to look at what differences are relevant. And then in terms of the solution, one of the lines that John put in the book that was beautiful is that our multiplicity and fluidity is leaning into our multiplicity and fluidity is one of the keys to belonging. Because it allows us to connect with more people. And leaning into that, there are these sort of like super identities that Amy Chua talked about. We all have multiple identities. We've stacked identities. We need some that connect us with a greater and ever larger number of people. And Daniel Allen has a beautiful quote about this, saying that what is initially bridging actually eventually becomes bonding as that circle widens and more people enter into it. And I think that's the way that John thinks about it as well. So to summarize, difference itself is not the key. It's the social relevancies that attach to certain differences. And then the question is, how can we actually lean into identities that allow us to connect with people who are otherwise outside of our current networks and social structures? And part of that is pulling ourselves into larger identities, creating new identities, telling stories that put us into community with people we otherwise wouldn't be, or just being bridgers and getting better and better at bridging practice, being bridging ambassadors, bridging practitioners, until eventually that bridging actually becomes bonding, and then we have to look outside of the further perimeter and connect more and more.
Let me just give you one quick example, and then I know we're at time. So I have a friend who does ethnographic studies of mixed marriages. He's been doing this for a long time. But his primary focus is not racial. It's actually ethnic. So he looks at Irish Americans marrying French Americans, marrying German Americans. And he's basically said that pool has become, on one hand, so porous that it almost has no meaning anymore. And it used to be, which many may be surprised, 1910s, 20s, 30s, not only do you have Irish Americans as a social category that was relevant, there's there was an Irish American community, there was a German American part of town with your own church, with your own language, with your own school. And it was a big deal to go outside of that to a mixed marriage. And a mixed marriage wasn't that German American marrying a black American, it was a German American marrying an Italian American. And it's like, don't be bringing that person to my house, right?
They're Catholic.
That phenomenon became so porous that he's saying it's hard to study now. Because everybody's doing it. They don't even think about it. They don't, I mean, they just, oh yeah, my husband is this, that, and the other. But it wasn't just them that did it. The structures and the culture changed. So modern white Americans came into being as a group after World War II. When we think of suburbanization of America, suburbanization was the recreation of whiteness in America. Whiteness became a race, not ethnicity, and all the different ethnic groups were invited in.
Who are the white.
Right, and they wrote this stuff, whites of a different color. So the point is that, you know, so it wasn't like, oh, German Americans moving down the street, we gotta leave. The government, though, played a significant role in terms of creating the physical space to facilitate this. And they're going to the same school now, they live in the same neighborhood. Obviously, they started marrying, so much so that most people don't even remember. It's like, go talk to your parents about it, right? So those differences were there. At one point, they're very important. Another point, differences are still there. They almost are completely meaningless. And it's what we did. So when we say these things are socially constructed, to think about how we construct them and how we can reconstruct them in a way that invites something different.
You're gonna kill me. I feel like I have to ask one more question. I have one more minute.
Go for it.
The answer is yes.
I love how you're playing, or not, you're not playing with it, but you're working with, essentially they're social capital-like concepts, and you're making them more complex. You're actually adding a lot of texture and depth to them. And I love that you brought up ethnic enclaves and the Chicagoan. And so yeah, sometimes the bonding forms they're beautiful, like you said, but they're prone to all sorts of different fractals of othering. Yet there's a beauty, and I think you talk about this in your book, there's a beauty in that kind of bonding. And that seems to be the tricky, how do we resist some of the oh so joyous aspects of these bonding mechanisms to get to belonging? Or where bonding is not enough to get to belonging. You always have to bond and bridge.
Let me take this verse and give John the final word. I'm
Okay.
sure a beautiful sign off here. So Daniel Allen again says that bonding is needed for healthy living. It's sort of like kids need a solid foundation to feel secure from which they can then venture off from. People need to have healthy bonding with people who share their own core identities. But you can't just stay there. You then have to bridge. So you need a combination of bonding and bridging. And what we say in the book is you cannot have a belonging society without bridging. But you also need, people also need to have that healthy space for bonding. The problem is when bonding becomes excessive. When bonding is excessive, then it actually closes people off and becomes what John calls breaking, which is where you are so into your group that you turn your back on other people. And so the trick is the careful balance. It's the balance there. It's, you have to put down your shield. You have to be vulnerable in order to bridge. But you have to, there's this image that John has sent me where it's like the core safe space, then the ring around it, and then the danger zone around that. You need to find your way into that middle ring. We're not gonna be completely comfortable and safe and build belonging without othering. There's some vulnerability, there's some risk to that. And we have to accept that risk if we want to do that. So the key is the balance of bridging and bonding. We need bridging for belonging outside of our groups. We need bonding for a healthy sense of self, but we can't excessively bond, otherwise it leads to breaking and further fragmentation.
So Susan, it's sort of interesting. Part of the thing, you know, and again, I sort of making some assumptions about social workers, right? Part of these things are the fallacy of the individual.
Yeah.
We're not making choices. So people didn't decide to live in suburban America. Suburban America was built and the cities was decimated, and it's like, get out of the city. You know, oh, you need a freeway? Here's one, I'll build you a freeway through your old neighborhood. So you can't come back to your old neighbor, it's gone.
Yeah.
So part of it is how do we actually also take advantage? We're here at Berkeley, right? 40,000 students brought together, which are going to have some kind of experience where they possibly can learn to bridge, where they're going to rub up against people who look differently than them. How do you make that part of their education? That's what education was about. Education was about bringing people together, as Dewey talked about, perspective taking. Perspective taking is bridging. How do you learn to bridge? So, I mean, to me, it's sort of, if you travel around the world, which I'm sure many of you have, you go to Canada, the way they do race in Canada, in the black community, very different than the way they do race in the United States. It's not because people in the United States just decided to do it differently, it's because the mechanisms were different. So, last example. I'm from Detroit, 6 of 9 children. My parents were not Catholic. In my parents' generation, their peers often had 12, 13 siblings, 18, 19 siblings. That was not unusual. Someone having 2 siblings, I'd be like, what's wrong? How did people decide in the 1850s, when the size of the families were on average 12, 13, 14 people, how did people decide in unison all across the country to now have 2 children? And there's a whole sociology about this, because what's happening in the United States, in Britain, in China, in Japan, educated middle-class families are having 2 or less children. Poor families, immigrant families, in Japan as Koreans, in the United States as Black and Latinos, are having 4 and 5 children. And literally, this is a debate going on right now in the White House. How do we get white middle-class women to have more children, and to get Black and Latino families to have less children? Literally, people are thinking about that and trying to figure out how to incentivize it.
Including Elon Musk.
So it's not like, let's go talk to the women and give them agency. And what a lot of economists say, these changes were part of the changes responding to the labor market, responding to working needs. And then you told a story about it. You know, when you needed women to get out of the house and into work, it was like, be a powerful woman, go to work, be autonomous. It's like, wait a minute, some of y'all need to go back to the house. You know, we have too many powerful women. So my point is that you see these large shifts in society happening literally all over the world. It can't be that each individual reflected on this and decided, hell, I'm not having 12 kids. You know, 6 of y'all get out of here. You know, something else is going on.
The pill, too.
And so again, this is why the social part of social welfare, I think, is really important. That if we keep boiling it down to the individual, we'll miss it. And that the bonding and bridging, we can bridge on a much larger level when we support it, when society says it's okay. So that, you know, we don't have the kind of bridging that we used to have among Irish Americans. I mean, maybe some, but they're not huge Irish American clubs or pubs. You know, it's like those niche here, you know, once a year you go have Irish American food. But most of your friends, if you're Irish American, are not Irish American. Are not. So you don't, it's not that you don't bond with them, but those bonds are thin. And your bonds with other social workers, if you're a lawyer, your bond with other lawyers is actually much thicker. How did that happen?
That was so fun. Thank you.